Our next panelist is Mr. Todd Shepherd, an investigative reporter for Broad and Liberty. Mr. Shepherd, welcome. You may begin.
Members of the General Assembly, it's an honor to testify before you today. I'm Todd Shepherd, a reporter with Broad and Liberty, based in Philadelphia. Just to give you a few quick sentences about my background, I received a degree in radio and television arts with a journalism emphasis in 2004 from Oklahoma Baptist University, so I'm not a native. I hope you won't hold that against me. While still a student, I began my career as a journalist with an Oklahoma City radio station, and in 2005, I moved to 850 KOA in Denver. While there, I won 3 regional Edward R. Murrow Awards, and I really would rather not even bring that up. I just mentioned to give you, to supply you with at least a couple of bona fides. I have reported on Pennsylvania issues, and in particular, Southeast Pennsylvania issues since 2020, when I began reporting for Delaware Valley Journal and then Broad and Liberty in 2021. Today, I will try to give you as accurate of testimony as possible about my reporting on the 2020 election grants distributed in Pennsylvania by the nonprofit group, the Center for Tech and Civic Life, or CTCL. My reporting on these grants extended over several months, and it is informed by about a dozen right-to-know law requests, as well as on-the-record responses from elected officials and governments. Before I go any further, I would like to state that my reporting was not intended to imply, nor do I personally believe, that Pennsylvania's election in 2020 was somehow stolen from Donald Trump. I believe Joe Biden duly won Pennsylvania and that he duly won the 2020 presidential election overall. But with that in mind, I would also say that when private money becomes involved in funding particular elements of government, rigorous scrutiny is warranted. I think a good example of this recently emerged from South Dakota when it was revealed that a deployment by that state's National Guard by the Republican governor was funded by an anonymous donor. That instance rightly raised questions as to whether the force of the South Dakota National Guard could be purchased by outside interests. Now to the matter at hand. Get out the vote efforts are as old as American elections, and they are a natural part of our political DNA. However, what we're examining today is if these election grants were really just running a get out the vote effort by coordinating with select county election offices, or running a get out the vote effort by using private money given to some election offices, but not all. And so I think that's a completely different animal than just regular get out the vote. In this presentation, I hope to show you that the grants awarded were heavily biased towards Democratic voting counties, that agents of the governor's office and the Secretary of State's office appear to have had a hand in creating that imbalance, that paid political consultants with partisan interests became involved, raising considerable ethical questions, and that some government actors involved with these grants knew about some of the political biases involved, but did not care, or in one instance I will show you, they told the public something very different than what they were saying behind closed doors. At the outset, I would also like to place in your mind a clear distinction about who we are talking about. Obviously, the grants, as we've heard, were made by the CTCL, the Center for Tech and Civic Life. But another player, the Center for Secure and Modern Elections, also plays a significant role. And obviously, you're all government officials, so you're very aware that these kinds of conversations get a little alphabet soupy from time to time. But if you could sort of orient your mind at the outset that I'll be referring to the Center for Tech and Civic Life as the CTCL, and the Center for Secure and Modern Elections is the CSME. And I will give you a much fuller description of who the CSME is later. As most of you know, the CTCL is a Chicago-based nonprofit that gave $22.5 million in grants to 23 counties prior to the 2020 election in Pennsylvania. And the raw dollar grants or dollar grant amounts are listed for you here. Now, one of the first stories we did at Broad and Liberty was to adjust these grants not on a population basis, but to adjust these grants on a registered voter basis. And our story contained the following graph. Now, this graph unfortunately does omit Armstrong County, which obtained a grant, but it would not have really altered the striking red-blue imbalance that you see. Keep in mind that the y-axis that I'm highlighting for you here is grant dollar per registered voter. And then along the x-axis, the counties were color-coded red or blue based on how that county voted in the 2016 presidential vote. Now, averaging out the grants this way is an important tool. The graph doesn't show that Philly got more money just because Philly is large. What this graph shows is that with these grants, Philadelphia had $8.83 that could be spent on each registered Joe citizen to vote. And in Luzerne or Erie County, these counties had about 75 cents of CTCL money to spend on each Joe citizen registered to vote in those counties. Generally speaking, the Republican theory of what these grants were intended to do goes like this, that the CTCL and its allies would use grants to greatly boost the election resources of blue counties so that turnout would be higher there, thereby boosting Democratic candidates. Unsurprisingly, I did not uncover any smoking gun to this effect. I did, however, find a tremendous amount of circumstantial evidence that would point in that direction with minimal circumstantial evidence that would point to the contrary. There is one important date I'd ask you also to remember as we talk about these grants, and that is September 1. That is when the CTCL announced that it had received a $250 million grant from Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan's foundation. Now, it was this donation, as you've already heard, that provided the CTCL with enough money that it moved from selectively inviting counties to inviting counties to then just making an open call. Any county that applied would get some kind of grant award. But emails I obtained through the Right to Know law show that no one involved with the CTCL grants appeared to know the September 1 Zuckerberg award was coming. And so this is instructive in many ways. If the persons in the government didn't know the open call was coming, it raises even more questions about how biased the process was before that date. The counties approached before September 1 were all blue counties. In my Right to Know request through the governor's office and the Department of State, I saw no emails in which those two government offices worked with or contacted any, what you would call a red county, prior to September 1. This also means that grants prior to September 1 still came from an unknown source. Interestingly, this is the exact reason that Bucks County declined the offer of a grant, because they investigated and they said, we cannot determine where the money is coming from. The handful of blue counties contacted in July and August of that year were given special assistance by outside consultants, some of them paid political consultants with clear partisan interests, and I will detail some of them to you in just a bit. Those consultants worked to make sure the county would get the maximum grant award. I found no similar emails for grant maximization with any of PA's red counties. Finally, with the exception of Center County, these counties that worked to get their grants and got the monies prior to September 1, they are the only counties that used satellite election offices, which not only greatly expanded the number of what you might call early voting days, but which also provided turnkey voting. In the thousands of emails I obtained, it became clear that the CTCL did very little of the administration work itself. Instead, it relied on many other actors, such as paid political consultants and nonprofits other than the CTCL. I believe this had the net effect of decreasing transparency, accountability, and it ran the risk of introducing the motivation of outside persons and groups. For example, this is the first email I could find in which Delaware County Councilwoman Christine Ruther was originally introduced to someone about the grants. And up top, you can see that this is July 24th. The email participants, I'll detail them for you now. They obviously contain Councilwoman Ruther. A man, Mark Solomon, he is a consultant who works for Civitas Public Affairs in New York City. He was working for the Center for Secure and Modern Elections. Jennifer Walls Lavelle, she was a staffer in Governor Wolf's office. Gwen Camp was an independent consultant working for the Voter Project. And finally, Kevin Mack, a Democratic consultant for Deliver Strategies, working for the Voter Project. Now, I want to focus on Mr. Mack for just a moment because he illustrates what I mean by outside interests and whether his involvement in these grants taints the perception of absolute neutrality that I believe an elections office must maintain. This is a quick look at Mr. Mack's corporate bio, and I think it's important to note that he lists himself as a senior partner, not just some employee, but a senior partner. This consulting group is paid to help deliver electoral wins. Now, here's a screenshot from the firm's client list from their website, but I'll give you a close-up of who some of these are. The firm's clients include Stacey Abrams, AFSCME, AFT, Bob Casey, President Obama, Hillary Clinton, House Majority PAC, which is Democrat-aligned, the NEA, and Elizabeth Warren. Deliver Strategies cannot be called bipartisan in any meaningful sense. They are hired guns to help unions and Democrats, period. And don't take my word for it. Their website says, we develop cutting-edge strategies because your campaign is too important to lose. Now, this is a closer look at Mr. Mack's biography page, and by the way, I would note that all of the biographies on the Deliver Strategies website have now been removed in the last couple of months. But on his 2021 bio, he said, Kevin Mack is a veteran political, communications, and direct mail strategist. Mr. Mack most recently served as lead strategist for the Voter Project in Pennsylvania, and this is the important part. Well, excuse me, let me back up. The lead strategist for the Voter Project in Pennsylvania, which was instrumental in signing up over 3.2 million people to vote by mail, and leading the soft side effort to win the swing state in 2020. Prior to that, Mack ran the Need to Impeach campaign. Pardon me if I take my reporting hat off, but I personally find it a little astonishing that someone who boasted that he led the soft side effort to help win this swing state was referring to his work on these grants, because the Voter Project, which he references in that same sentence, was instrumental in getting these grants to counties in the Southeast, particularly Chester and Delaware. So let's take a quick look at the Voter Project. What is this project for which Mr. Mack was the lead strategist? On the screen, you can see a screenshot from the webpage from the Voter Project, but here's an expansion of the fine print down below where it says it's a fiscal sponsorship of the Keystone Research Center. The Keystone Research Center, as I'm sure many of you know, is a left-of-center think tank. Next on the screen, you'll see some of the union donations made to the Keystone Research Center, and this data is available from the National Department of Labor and their search tool of annual union disclosures. Not surprisingly, many of the unions that give to the Keystone Research Center, they are some of the same unions that Deliver Strategies boasts as clients. And one final thing about Deliver Strategies. These are several screenshots I took from the FEC website of payments made by the Pennsylvania Democratic Party you see on the left that I'm highlighting for you. And these were made in 2020 for work they did on campaigns of some familiar names, such as Eugene DePasquale, Christine Finello, Susan Wild for Congress, Mary Gay Scanlon's election campaign. I would ask the committee if it's okay for a for-profit and obviously partisan consulting group to be advising, monitoring, and sometimes selectively inviting counties, while at the same time that consulting group is getting paid to advance candidates who are on the ballot elsewhere in the state. In my eyes, this seems to be a clear conflict of interest. When I asked Delaware County about Mr. Mack's partisan leaning and his activities, I was given this response from County Councilwoman Christine Ruther. You can see that she begins by saying, I'm not sure I ever met him, and I think we've all had those kinds of answers before where we don't know if we perhaps met someone incidentally. But then I've highlighted in bold for you, I think the most important part she said, where she said, it does not and would not have made a difference to me. Next, I'd like to focus on Jennifer Walls-Lavelle, who worked in Governor Tom Wolf's office. First, here you see a quick shot of her LinkedIn profile. And on this screen, you'll see an email I obtained where you'll see how she described her job. She said she was, quote, a special advisor to the Chief of Staff on election reform. In this role, I am serving as liaison between the Governor's Office, the Department of State, county election offices, and outside stakeholders with the goal of implementing Pennsylvania's new election reforms in the most robust and equitable way possible, end quote. So I know I've just introduced you to Ms. Walls-Lavelle, but I need to step back for just a second while I also introduce you to a 501c4 called Project Keystone. On the screen, you'll see Project Keystone's incorporation documents, and it says that it provides, quote, polling services to organizations, candidates, and elected officials in Pennsylvania. So Project Keystone is a Democratic polling outfit. And here are some screenshots from the Pennsylvania Campaign Finance website that shows you who funds Project Keystone. These are campaign expenditures to Project Keystone. So right there, I'm highlighting, this is AFSCME that's given, $70,000. Below that is the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, which is, in that little block had given $228,000 to Project Keystone. If we look at the next screenshot, you'll see the PSEA enter the picture with $183,000 to them. The Senate Democratic Campaign Committee, $171,000 to Project Keystone. Now, this is important because I'd like you to look now at the 2018 IRS 990 form for Project Keystone. The treasurer listed second on this is Jessica Walls-Lavelle, who I just introduced you to. But what's interesting about this is the person listed at number 7 is Miss Fiona Conroy. Ms. Conroy is important because she is a partner at Deliver Strategies, who I told you about earlier. So, Jennifer Walls-Lavelle, who is the special advisor on election reform, when she is working with Deliver Strategies, she is essentially working with her old partisan colleagues. And quickly on the screen, there are some of the other groups affiliated with Project Keystone. Now, I would quickly add that when Ms. Walls-Lavelle moved to Governor Wolf's office, she was no longer affiliated with Project Keystone. Of course, that's entirely appropriate. I just don't want anyone to think that I'm suggesting she was at both entities at the same time. Next on this screen is an email from August 17th in which Mark Solomon, who I talked about earlier, tells Delaware County Councilwoman Ruther that we've invited Chester, Montco, and Bucks to apply. They're on it. Well, just 2.5 hours before that, Walls-Lavelle reached out to Chester County to begin the invitation process with that county. And so my questions are, why isn't the CTCL reaching out for this invitation? Why is an agent of the government making the invitation? Is the CTCL borrowing from the government's reputation and credibility by having someone in the government make the introduction? For example, is the county more likely to think that these grants have already been vetted somehow, or that this is an approved project if the Department of State is the one reaching out making the initial invitation? I also think it's appropriate to ask if Ms. Walls-Lavelle was taking direction from Mark Solomon at this point. And finally, why is this agent of the government inviting some counties, but not all counties? So, as I've mentioned him several times, next I'd like to introduce you to Mark Solomon. Mr. Solomon is a principal with Civitas Public Affairs in New York City. Generally speaking, his clients are less partisan than Deliver Strategies, but I still think it's very fair to characterize his work as left of center, which is entirely fine on its own right. Mr. Solomon and his firm represent the Center for Secure and Modern Elections, and in emails I obtained, Mr. Solomon identifies himself as working on behalf of that group. What's important to know about the CSME is that it is not a 501c3 such as the CTCL is, but rather it's a fiscally sponsored project of the New Venture Fund. And on the screen, you'll see a job posting by the Center for Secure and Modern Elections in which it identifies itself, highlighted in red, as a New Venture Fund project. This is important because New Venture Fund is managed by Arabella Advisors. And Arabella Advisors is what the Atlantic magazine called the massive progressive dark money group you've never heard of. The New York Times just this January wrote a report on these groups with the headline, Democrats decried dark money, then they won with it in 2020. And here's a quote where they specifically point out that the New Venture Fund is a part of that network of activity. So these actors and activities raise the following questions for me. Why is the CSME more involved in the grant management process than the CTCL? The public was told they were getting grants by the CTCL. They were not told, ever, that they were getting work by the CSME. Did the PA counties that vetted the CTCL, did they also vet the CSME? Were they happy with those results and answers? Would grants from the CSME have sparked controversy sooner because they were managed by Arabella? Would it have been harder to call those grants nonpartisan? So now that you're familiar with most of the players, let me walk you through some of the remaining issues I uncovered. I appreciate you all sticking with me this long. On the screen, you'll see more pre-September 1 efforts to bring in another blue county, Lackawanna. This is Gwen Camp. Remember, she works for the Voter Project, which Kevin Mack was the lead strategist on. You'll also see Jessica Walls-Lavelle is included in the email. On occasion, Mark Solomon and the CSME said they wanted the grants to go to highly populated counties with large minority populations that had possibly been underserved. Well, according to U.S. Census data, Lackawanna has a black population of 3.9%. So at a time when there is no open call, why are they reaching out to this county? For example, if it's about underserved communities, Berks has a much higher black and Hispanic population, and it's also just twice as big in terms of raw population. Yet I obtained no emails at all before or after September 1 in which the Department of State was actively inviting Berks or counties similar to Berks. However, by the 2020 election, we do know that Lackawanna did have about a 37,000 voter registration advantage in favor of Democrats. On the screen now is an email between Councilwoman Ruther and Delaware County Solicitor William Bill Martin. Mr. Martin was sending her some information on who comprised and funded the CTCL. When she read over this information, Ms. Ruther responded, "Not at all surprising. I am seeking funds to fairly and safely administer the election so everyone legally registered to vote can do so and have their votes count. If a left-leaning public charity wants to further my objective, I am good with it. I will deal with the blowback." Well, the next slide shows you that about 2 weeks later, the county put out a press release announcing the grant. So while behind closed doors, Ms. Ruther was characterizing the CTCL as left-leaning, in public, the county, as I've circled for you in red, was describing the CTCL as nonpartisan. This illustrates clear issues with transparency and accountability. On the next slide, you'll see some of the conversation about bringing in Montgomery County. The email begins down, it's actually a chain of emails, and it begins down below where Mark Solomon is emailing two executives with the CTCL, and he says, "What think you, Sam and Tiana? It's an application for $1.2 million, the third largest county in the state. Philly suburbs, exclamation point." He then goes on to add, "Shall we turn it into more of a plan, or could this suffice?" Well, this last sentence in particular raises questions for me. Why is Montgomery County's initial application not enough for Mr. Solomon right off the bat? Does Mr. Solomon have knowledge of needs that the county has, that the county itself is ignorant of? Also, take note that the CTCL, or right below the green box there, take note that the CTCL executive looked at the original $1.1 million grant submitted by Montgomery, which had already included a proposal for 4 or 5 satellite sites, satellite voting locations, and yet this CTCL executive still wants more satellite voting offices. This raises my curiosity and suspicions, at least in Montgomery County, that these grants were less about a COVID safety effort, but more about a get out the vote effort. And on this email, I won't linger on it long, but Mr. Solomon is so interested in this particular grant to Delaware County that he asks Councilwoman Ruther if there are concerns about getting the necessary political approvals there. So he's asking a sitting councilwoman for what I would call political reconnaissance information, and she gives it to him. Why is this necessary? The grantor seems very invested that this grant go through and that it happen in this county, in Delaware County. Just as a point of information, in Delaware County, of course, Democrats had taken a roughly 18,000 voter registration advantage in 2016, and by 2020, that had become a 47,000 voter registration advantage. Good for them, no criticisms there, but it may be indicative of why Mr. Solomon so closely monitored that grant in Delaware. In another email, Mr. Solomon proposes drafting a press release for the county about the grant. Councilwoman Ruther told me by email that the county did not use a press release drafted by anyone else, but I think it's indicative of the potential pitfalls of these kinds of arrangements, that you have a paid political consultant, Mark Solomon, who doesn't even work for the grant-giving entity. He works for an Arabella-managed dark money agency, the CSME, and he's the one proposing to draft the whole press release on behalf of the county and the Center for Tech and Civic Life. Again, I feel this illustrates some pretty clear transparency and accountability issues. Additionally, you'll see that he says he wants to frame the award smartly around COVID, etc. Why does the press release need to be framed smartly? This phrasing certainly allows for the question as to whether COVID safety was the legitimate top priority interest for these grants, and not instead of boosting turnout in the exact right places. We're getting close. Now on the screen, and this is post-September 1, but Ms. Walls-Lavelle is sending a completed grant from Center County, again, another blue county, and she's sending this to Mark Solomon, the New York City-based consultant for the CSME. And once she sends that to him, he responds, "Can you find out what Lehigh is planning to do?" Solomon then, in the top, he ultimately answers his own question, and he says, "Just talk to Gwen." Remember, that's Gwen Camp from the Voter Project, and she's going to take on Lehigh. Now again, these officials in the government and this dark money not-for-profit, even after the open call goes out, they keep a high interest in shepherding the grants for blue counties, but not at all for any of the red counties in Pennsylvania. Another example of that, even after the open call goes out on September 1, Gwen Camp goes back to Delaware County to see if they can get even more money at that particular county. So now that the barn door's open to everyone, can we maybe turn it up by another $1 million in Delaware County? And this is my final exhibit. This is the mid-August email from then Secretary of State Kathy Bookvar to a county commissioner in Bucks County, which establishes the communication about the CTCL grants. Bucks obviously is a very purplish county, but it did vote Democratic in the 2016 election. But still, I feel this selective invitation to an election grant by the state's top election official needs answers. Why is she making the introductions instead of the CTCL? And just to drive home the question, with just 2.5 months to go before the election, why is the Secretary of State inviting some counties to get this grant money, but not others? How was she deciding who to reach out to? Was she told by the CTCL or CSME who the preferred counties were? Or did she decide who those counties were herself? If she did decide by herself, what information or concerns guided those decisions? I would like you to know that across my 5 or 6 reports on this issue, I always reached out to Mark Solomon, provided they were named. I always reached out to Mark Solomon, the CTCL, the CSME, Ms. Camp, Ms. Walls-Lavelle, Mr. Mack, the New Venture Fund, and former Secretary of State Bookvar. For most of them, I reached out more than once, as you would expect, and I never once received any response to my many requests for comment. Members of the committee, I appreciate your attention. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be here through the rest of the meeting to answer any questions you may have.